everyone, Tarkable Trades here. Now today, I want to jump right in and talk about two very similar prominent arguments for the existence of God. Anselm's ontological argument and Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument. While these arguments are highly regarded in philosophical circles, they are ultimately unsound and inapplicable to our current understanding of reality. By examining their premises and logical structures, I aim to demonstrate why these arguments fail to provide a convincing case for the existence of a deity. Ontological arguments are a category of philosophical arguments that use a priori reasoning to conclude the existence of God. Unlike empirical arguments, which rely on sensory experience and observation, ontological arguments are based on logic and definitions. These arguments have intrigued and challenged philosophers for centuries due to their abstract and seemingly counterintuitive nature. Anselm of Canterbury's ontological argument, presented in his work Proslogion, is one of the most famous and discussed arguments for the existence of God. It is a classic a priori argument that seeks to prove God's existence through reason alone. Here is a detailed outline of the argument along with supporting reasoning provided by Anselm. First, a definition. God is defined as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 1. It is possible to conceive of a being which nothing greater can be conceived. Premise 2. A being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the mind. Premise 3. If God exists only in the mind, then it is possible to conceive of a greater being, one that exists both in the mind and in reality. Premise 4. But it is not possible to conceive of a being greater than God. By definition, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Conclusion, therefore, God must exist in reality as well as in the mind. This argument is essentially saying that the concept of God inherently includes existence, because a God that does not exist would not be the greatest conceivable being. Anselm's supporting reasoning is primarily rooted in the logical implications of his definition of God and the nature of existence. Anselm begins with a concept of God that is universally understandable, even to those who do not believe in God. This concept forms the foundation of his argument. Anselm argues that existence in reality is a perfection or a great-making property. A being that exists in reality is greater than a being that exists only in the understanding. This claim is based on the intuition that something that exists in reality can have actual effects and interact with the world, whereas something that exists only in the mind cannot. Anselm employs a reductio ad absurdum approach. He assumes, for the sake of argument, that God exists only in the understanding. He then shows that this assumption leads to a contradiction because it implies that it is possible to conceive of a greater being than God, one that exists in reality, which contradicts the definition of God as the greatest conceivable being. Anselm's ontological argument has faced significant criticism over the centuries, leading many philosophers to question its viability. Here are the major criticisms. Ganilo's criticism, the perfect island. Ganilo argued that one could define a perfect island as that than which nothing greater can be conceived. According to Anselm's logic, this perfect island must exist, because an island that exists in reality is greater than one that exists only in the mind. However, this conclusion is absurd, as it implies the existence of a perfect island merely by defining it into existence. Immanuel Kant's criticism, existence is not a predicate. Kant argued that existence is not a predicate or a property that can add to the concept of a being. Saying that something exists does not add any characteristics to the concept of that thing. It merely asserts that the concept is instantiated in reality. For example, the concept of $100 does not change whether the $100 exists or not. Thus, Kant's critique challenges the logical structure of Anselm's argument by denying that existence can enhance the greatness of a being. Therefore, Kant contended that Anselm's argument fails because it treats existence as a property that can make a being greater. David Hume's criticism, conceptual versus real existence. Hume argued that one cannot move from the realm of definitions and ideas to the realm of reality and existence. Just because we can conceive of a greatest possible being does not necessarily mean that such a being exists in reality. The leap from conceptual existence to real existence is a major logical step that needs more justification. For example, one can conceive of a perfect unicorn, a unicorn with all conceivable great-making properties. But this does not mean that a perfect unicorn exists in reality. Logical criticism, questioning the premises. Anselm's definition of God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived is not universally accepted or intuitively obvious. Different individuals have different conceptions of what constitutes greatness. For instance, one person might consider omnipotence as the highest form of greatness, while another might value moral perfection more. This subjectivity makes the definition less universally compelling. Since different cultures and philosophies have varying concepts of a divine or ultimate reality, the argument is considerably less compelling. Modal logic criticism. Possible worlds. The concept of maximal greatness and its implication for the existence in all possible worlds is problematic. There is debate over whether it is logically coherent to claim that a being can exist necessarily in all possible worlds based purely on its definition. To briefly summarize, Anselm's ontological argument, while innovative and thought-provoking, faces substantial challenges. Gonilo's parody highlights the potential for absurd conclusions if the logic is applied to other concepts. Kant's predicate argument argues that existence is not a property and thus cannot be used to define something into existence. Hume's conceptual real distinction emphasizes the gap between mental concepts and external reality. Logical and modal issues raise questions about the definition and logical structure used in the argument. These criticisms have led many philosophers to conclude that Anselm's argument in its original form is not viable proof of God's existence. However, it remains an important and influential argument in the history of philosophy, inspiring further debate and refinement of ontological arguments. Having gone through Anselm's argument, let me now move on to one of the strongest forms of the ontological argument, that is, Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument. Plantinga, a contemporary philosopher, uses modal logic to address some of the criticisms of Anselm's original argument and to provide a more rigorous framework. Here is a detailed outline of Plantinga's version. First, a couple definitions. A being has maximal excellence in a given possible world if and only if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect in that world. A being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. Here is the actual argument. Premise 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Conclusion: therefore, a maximally great being exists. Plantinga's argument relies on the concept of possible worlds and the logical coherence of the existence of a maximally great being. Possible worlds are complete and consistent ways the world could be. They are used to evaluate the truth of modal statements. A maximally great being, by definition, must exist in all possible worlds if it exists in any world. The concept of maximal greatness encompasses maximal excellence, which includes omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection. Such a being must exist necessarily in all possible worlds. Plantinga argues that the concept of a maximally great being is logically coherent. If it is coherent, then its existence is possible. Let's look at the strengths of Plantinga's argument. The use of modal logic provides a clear and concise framework for the argument, addressing some of the ambiguities and criticisms of Anselm's original formulation. The possibility premise, premise 1, is a key strength. If one accepts that the existence of a maximally great being is possible, the argument logically follows to the conclusion that such a being exists necessarily. Plantinga's formulation is designed to address common objections, such as those related to the nature of existence as a property and the coherence of the concept of a maximally great being. Plantinga's version of the argument attempts to rectify some of the issues with Anselm's ontological argument. However, it still suffers similar issues. Let's look at some of the main criticisms associated with the argument. Possibility premise, premise 1. The argument hinges on the premise that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. This premise is not self-evident and requires justification. If the possibility of a maximally great being is not accepted, the argument fails. Similar to Gonilo's perfect island criticism of Anselm, critics suggest that the possibility premise can be used to prove the existence of other absurd entities, e.g. a maximally great pizza. These parody arguments challenge the special status of the possibility premise in Plantinga's argument. Definition of maximal greatness. I have to question whether the concept of a maximally great being is even coherent. I argue that attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection may be logically incompatible or incoherent when applied to a single being. This is effectively the omni paradox. The argument moves from the possibility of a maximally great being existing in one possible world to its necessary existence in all possible worlds. This transition is not necessarily justified. Just because a being is maximally great in one possible world does not mean that it must exist in every possible world. The assumption that necessary existence is a property of maximal greatness needs more justification. Possible world semantics. Some philosophers argue that the possible worlds framework used in modal logic is a useful heuristic, but may not accurately reflect metaphysical reality. This raises doubts about the validity of arguments based on possible worlds semantics. The argument might be circular because it assumes what it's trying to prove. By assuming that a maximally great being is possible, the argument essentially assumes the existence of God from the outset. On top of these criticisms, there are at least 3 logical fallacies I can point out. Begging the question is a fallacy in which the conclusion is assumed in one of its premises. The argument presupposes that a maximally great being, which necessarily exists, is possible. This assumption might be seen as assuming the existence of God, thus begging the question. Equivocation is using a word in different senses in different parts of the argument. The term possible might be used ambiguously. In modal logic, possible has a specific technical meaning related to possible worlds, but in ordinary language, it can simply mean conceivable or not contradictory. This ambiguity can lead to the equivocation fallacy. Special pleading is applying standards, principles, or rules to other people or circumstances while making oneself or certain circumstances exempt from the same critical criteria. By asserting that the possibility of a maximally great being is different from other parodies, just like the maximally great pizza, the argument may be seen as engaging in special pleading without sufficient justification. In summary, Plantinga's modal ontological argument is a sophisticated and formally valid argument that uses modal logic to argue for the existence of a maximally great being. However, it faces several critical problems. The possibility premise requires justification and is not universally accepted. The coherence of maximal greatness is questionable at best, and attributes like omniscience and omnipotence may be incompatible. Possible world semantics may not accurately reflect metaphysical reality. The argument might be seen as circular by assuming the possibility of God's existence. Some potential logical fallacies include begging the question, it assumes the conclusion in the premises, equivocation, it uses ambiguous terms around possible, and special pleading, applying the different standards without justification. These issues suggest that while Plantinga's argument is influential and thought-provoking, it is not without significant challenges and objections. In conclusion, both Anselm's ontological argument and Plantinga's modal ontological argument face significant philosophical challenges. Anselm's argument fails due to the flawed premise that existence is a predicate and the conceptual leap from definitions to reality. Plantinga's argument, while more sophisticated, relies on a questionable possibility premise and the coherence of maximal greatness. Furthermore, both arguments fall short in providing empirical evidence, which is crucial in our current understanding of reality. Thus, these arguments are not sound or applicable to demonstrating the existence of a deity. That's it for this one. So what do you think? Do you think Anselm and Plantinga provided convincing arguments for the existence of God? Or do you think that the problems in them render them unsound or not viable? Let me know in the comments below. Arguments like these are a lot of fun to look over and investigate. Taking them apart to check how good the logic is an excellent philosophical exercise. It helps me keep my brain sharp. So let me know if there are any other arguments you'd like me to take apart. If enjoyment existed in your mind, hit that like button to show that it exists in reality too. Though you can bridge the gap between the conceptual and the real by hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already for more educational content. My Discord is running strong with a number of topic rooms. A link to join that is in the description. Though I need to give thanks to my maximally great patrons: Calamitous Anima, Sora, Long-Haired Lefty, Musical Ocelot, Ooga Booga Luga, Anonymous Netizen, Tarek Alkazab, Jemimam, Kai Henningsen, and Triple Towel. Though if you'd like to improve the greatness of my channel to maybe extend to other possible worlds, you can join them for as low as a single $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. And as always, keep learning.